Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, it's Rory from the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's great to be here, and it's great to be able to bring you theory and skills in the form of a podcast. And with me is my partner in therapy, Kenneth Kelly. Hi, Ken.
Great to be here and excited at this, the maiden voyage of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And hopefully this is a place where you will find like-minded people sharing a really special journey, that journey going from student into potentially, depending on what your plans are, a practicing therapist. And we're here to support you along the way. I know Rory has been counselling for many years, but you've also been a tutor for a number of years, Rory, and you're bringing all that to the table.
Absolutely. I've been a tutor for over 15 years. I literally went from graduation to the classroom. I still practice, and I've taught at practice level for over a decade. So I'm hoping to bring that kind of knowledge and passion and the kind of excitement that I hope to generate in my classroom environment across the internet onto the podcast, so everybody can get a sense of, you know, the fun to some extent of learning counselling, that personal development, that making sure that you are the best therapist you can be. And I hope we can do that.
Oh, yeah. And I'm rubbing my hands together with eagerness. And I can share with you all that I shared a number of years working with Rory as a tutor. So we're teaming up again to bring you the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And just to give you a kind of a bite of what you might expect here today and from future podcasts as well, we aim to kind of reflect what you might get in the college or in the class or in the university environment, where we're going to be kind of bringing a little bit of theory. We're going to be talking about skills, and we're going to be looking at personal and professional development.
There's no better place to start, Ken, when we're talking about any counselling journey, and certainly something that we would do on day one in my classroom environment. And that, of course, is make a contract, talk about contracting, what is contracting and why it's important. And I think that this is something that professionally, certainly the new ethical framework is going to be asking more of us in terms of making sure that our contracts are, well, they're the best for our clients, and also that they can be understood. So in this podcast, we're going to be talking about contracting, some of the pitfalls in contracting, and some of the things that sometimes just may not be in awareness. So I know you contract, Ken, and as a therapist, and I contract. Just tell us a little bit about your contracting style, because everybody's slightly different.
Sure. And I guess when you're listening to this and Rory's mentioning the ethical framework, we're speaking about the BACP, that's the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists, and that's based in the United Kingdom. So if you're listening in from a different country, check with your kind of umbrella body of what the requirements are. But we certainly are required to contract with our clients. And you know what? You came into this podcast and we contracted right at the beginning. We told you what you were going to get. We told you what to expect, and we told you what was on offer. And that's exactly what we're doing with our clients. And I guess this is empowering our clients to know what to expect from the counselling process. Many people coming into counselling not even having a clue what counselling is, never being in counselling before. And the contracting phase gives us an opportunity to lay out our stall. I'm taking these words from one of Rory's lecture. He uses the words lay out your stall. You're laying out your stall, you're putting it out, and you're packing out what it is that you do. What it is you don't do, I think that's really important as well, what the client can expect. And the reason for this, for me, is to empower the client, because it's their journey. It's not our journey as counsellors, it is the client's journey. And if they know what is on offer, they know the boundaries that are kind of set in place by the contract, it allows them autonomy, freedom to move within those boundaries and be free.
Absolutely. And, you know, as everything we do in the teaching and the podcast, we work in service of the clients. And there's no better way of demonstrating that service than talking about the contract. And I'm going to start off by giving an indication of why we contract. It's a question I get asked as a lecturer all the time. The reason why we contract is because if we work for an organisation. Maybe some of you are in placements, working with charities and organisations. It's part of their agreement with the people who fund them that the therapists that are working within the organisation will work professionally, and part of that's a contract. So there's an organisational kind of need for it, but also on a personal need. You wouldn't buy, you wouldn't go and buy a car or a mobile phone off someone who said, "There we go. If you just send me £20 a month, that'll be lovely." I know when I bought my mobile phone, there was a detailed contract of what I was getting, how much it was going to cost me, how long I was going to be paying for it. And, if in every walk of life, when we're setting up a professional agreement with another professional, we have a contract. And in counselling, it's no different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the four corners rule. Have you ever come across that term in contracting, the four corners rule?
Only in our preamble, if I'm being really congruent and telling it how it is. We had a preamble before we kind of went into this talking about contracting. So I heard about it then, Rory, but tell us about that four-corner rule.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm not an expert in contract law, but I've done enough research to understand a little bit about contracting. And the four corners rule, if you get yourself a piece of A4 paper and you look at the four corners, anything that's written on there in the form of an agreement is called a four corners rule. So when you've written a contract down, that's it. If you both agreed to it, that's it. You can't then alter it without the other person's permission, nor can you put anything in which in law is called parole evidence. Now, I thought parole was something that prisoners got if they behave themselves in prison, but apparently it's a legal term, which means adding something after the fact. So you can't, if I said to you, Ken, I'm going to sell you my mobile phone, it'll cost you £25 a month for 2 years, and you say, that's fine, Rory, and then a week later I say, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you £40 a month. I've just kind of changed my mind. Yep. That wouldn't be acceptable. So anything that's in a contract has to be agreed by both parties, and it can't be added to. If you need to change the contract, both parties need to agree. And that's what we call the four corners rule. Anything that's within a contract is within four corners of it, and unless the other person agrees for it to be changed, then hey, you can't change it. So what kind of things do we put in contracts? I think that's pretty much important. So in the preamble that Ken was talking about before, we were just talking about his contract. So what are the kind of things that you put in your contract, Ken?
I'm going to go through them for you in a moment. I just want to let you know that I will make a version of my contract. I'm going to just strip out all of my kind of practice details, but I'll make a version of my contract available if you want to download it and have a look at it as an example for yourself. You can do that on the show notes page, so make sure you go visit that. It'll have all the links and kind of all the downloads from today's episode. Now, before I go over kind of some of the things that are in the contract, I just want to emphasize how important it is what Rory said about the four corners, and he mentioned a piece of paper. Have a written contract,
absolutely,
as opposed to a verbal contract, because this is not the four corners of the room rule, it is the four corners of the paper rule. Because here's the thing, if you get into difficulty and you approach your professional body for assistance, or if you approach your insurer because a complaint has been laid against you, the first thing they're going to ask for is your contract. Make sure you have one, and make sure that you have a contract with each and every client. So I guess, what is it that you want to be looking at in your contract? So first and foremostly, what is on offer? What is it that you as a therapist are offering? And that would include the modality of the kind of counselling that you do. So myself, I'm a person-centred counsellor, and I will mention within my contract that I offer person-centred counselling, and a little description of what that is, which I will also cover verbally with the client in the first meeting, so that they're not, I guess, being missold and thinking that the kind of counselling they get is the kind that they saw on the television, where they lie down on a couch. That's not going to happen with me.
Tell me about your mother, that type of thing.
Well, exactly. So it's about what are you offering?
Yeah.
The next thing to be looking at is, when is this going to happen? It's going to happen at an agreed place and at an agreed time. So the time and place, when is this going to be happening? Because you can't be on call 24/7 for the client to give you a call when they feel that they're in difficulty. So it's at a specific time and a specific place. So mention that, the time and where you're going to be meeting. there's obviously the requirements that you as a counsellor or the promises that you are making within that contract to your client. But similarly, the client has responsibilities as well. A must in your contract is any limitations that you may have in confidentiality. Somebody coming into counselling may be carrying really heavy, difficult stuff. They're looking for a safe place to share this. They may have a thought or a feeling that everything they say is completely confidential. How crushing would it be if they mentioned something and you turned around and went, "Oh, sadly, we've got a rule in our agency here. I now have to tell somebody that you've taken that." That is crushing them and kind of that we hold sacred as counsellors. So this is your opportunity right in the beginning to outline where you would have to break confidentialities. And of course, the obvious ones are legislation. And of course, you would look to the legislation of your country that you're listening to this from. Here in the UK, it is acts of terrorism, money laundering, Child Protection Act.
Drug trafficking.
Thank you.
Any statutory law. Yes. Statutory law is the law that's been passed through Parliament. And I think one of the really interesting things about contracting that what really confuses student counsellors is they get the BACP ethical framework, which is the UK kind of body for ethics, one of the UK bodies for ethics. And they say, well, hang on a second. In one hand, in my right hand, I've got the BACP Code of Ethics. So I'm writing my contract. In my left hand, I've got my agency's policies. And my agency's policies have exceptions to confidentiality. What do I do? Because it feels like if I break confidentiality for one area, I'm breaking the BACP ethical framework's idea of confidentiality. So what you do is you merge the two together. And I'll give you a real example of that. A few years ago, I visited colleagues who are working in recovery areas, and they were working in a drugs rehabilitation centre. And they had counselling in there. And one of the areas that they specifically asked therapists to disclose was if a client was using street drugs. And there's a very good reason for that, because if someone's coming off heroin, which is a very dangerous drug, and they're having a prescription to help them with that, and then they go and buy stuff on the street when you don't know what you're buying, they could possibly have a heart attack. So it was really important that the treatment team understood or knew if a client was topping up with street drugs. And one of the exceptions to confidentiality in the contract was, if I believe or you tell me you're taking street drugs, I'm going to have to break confidentiality. Now, the key thing here is the client's understanding the terms of the contract. Yeah. Okay. So if you're upfront with it, there's no problem with having an exception to confidentiality as long as the client agrees. That's it. So in that case, that is quite acceptable, and that confuses. It's certainly in my classes, it confuses the hell out of people. They say, well, we've got the agency's confidentiality, and we've also got the BACPs. Well, what you do is you join them together, and you make a contract that covers it all, and then the client then decides whether they want to engage in therapy. And it's really interesting that all agencies, if you're a student out there and you've done your kind of induction with the agency you're working for, they will all of them should have a policy of breaking confidentiality with harm to self, harm to others, or harm you may do to yourself. And that's a catch-all confidentiality, a way you can break confidentiality in the contract. So just to clarify, you can have two codes of practice, the BACP, and I'm waving my hands around here, no one will ever see it, the BACP confidentiality. That's what I do in class, I wave my hands around a lot. You never see it on the podcast. You can have the BACP confidentiality in the right hand, you can have the agency's policies in the left hand, and what you do is you write them together to form a contract which covers them all. And again, as long as the client understands the limits of confidentiality, then you're working ethically.
As a counsellor, you may undergo supervision. And part of your supervision may be taking a client's journey and speaking to your supervisor about it. Tell your client, put it into your contract so that they know what's happening with their information. So supervision and confidentiality can form part of your contract. It certainly does on mine. And again, you can get the download and have a look at that. And if you are working in a placement and you're a student of counselling psychotherapy and you're recording your sessions, Put it in your contract. Put in the contract what happens to those recordings, how they're stored, who owns those, when are they destroyed, who listens to them. Are you using parts of those in case discussion with your peers? It's fine as long as it is discussed and agreed with your client and they know exactly what they're agreeing to. They know the limitations and the boundaries of that confidentiality. Really important.
It is, Ken. And one of the things that irritates me, Ken will know this, about I get irritated about lack of transparency. And I have heard, some practices saying, whatever you do, don't tell the client you're a student. And when I hear that, first of all, I get a little bit. Anybody who kind of has been taught by me, I get a bit grumpy and a bit. No, you can't be doing that. And the reason for it is, if you're not transparent from the moment that you're sitting in front of your client, you're not being an ethical therapist.
Yeah.
And the BACP say you should tell someone you're a student therapist. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's some urban legends in the counselling world where, well, if you tell them you're a student, they may not feel like you're doing a good job and that type of thing. It's not right, and on the whole, it's nonsense. I was a student counsellor. I told all my clients I was a student in my final years of training, and I never had a problem with it. I never had a problem with it.
It disappears if you are open and honest, and if we look at congruence of being fully there and fully transparent within the relationship, and Rogers recognizes that as something that is necessary. It needs to be there.
Absolutely.
You need to be open and transparent, and I hear what you're saying about certain agencies may say, you know what, you don't really need to tell them that. But here's the thing: this is not the agency's practice. It's yours. From
Absolutely.
The very first moment that you are in contact with your very first client, whether that be on your placement, while you're training, you are in practice, and it is your practice, not your agency's practice. It's going to go with you, and it's about deciding how are you going to be in your practice. Be open, honest, and transparent. And here's the reality. I'm going to disclose, I trained under Rory as well. I was a counselling student of Rory's.
Long time ago, Ken.
It was a long time ago, and I'm very grateful for that journey. But I remember that lesson, and I remember taking that into my placement. And here's the thing. I never had one single client who even raised an eyebrow. No. From the first moment that the client started presenting with their story and where they were, all of that disappeared. And I was no longer a student counsellor. I was just their counsellor.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final thing before we move on, if you're, when I started, my tutor said to me, "Oh, well, your contract's not enforceable under law," and in fact, all that time ago, that they were right. However, things have moved on a bit now. So if you're in private practice, like Ken is, and you say, "I'll be available to see you on Thursday," and you consistently don't turn up, you're in breach of your contract, and that means the client can take action against you. So, don't be thinking that a contract is just a procedure that I have to go through. It could potentially be a legal document, and finally, we talked today really about what I call procedural contracting, which is the nuts and bolts of a client agreeing the terms, if you like, of engaging in therapy. But there are other contracts, and sometimes in the world of TA, for instance, there's therapy contracts where clients will verbally agree to take a set of actions forward in a way of kind of helping them apply the theory. So maybe we cover therapy contracts another time, Ken. What do you think?
Yeah, and we have an expert in our magic box, I guess.
We do.
We may even get an expert in to come and speak
about, not just the person.
about transactional analysis and how contracts differ quite considerably, how every aspect of therapy is really contracted, and that contract is adjusted as you go. But for now, those nuts and bolts, you've got them. And I'd like to give you something to do. Have a think about your contract. If you're in an agency and you say, "Oh, it's all right, they've got a contract," it's not their practice, it's yours. Have a look at their contract. Are you happy with it? Is there anything you want to add to that? Is there anything you disagree with that? Does your client have the option to say, actually, I don't agree with that part of your contract. Can we change it? Challenge yourself and think about contracts. Speak to your peers about contracts. Download my contract, have a look, use it as a guide, and put your own contract together. So there we have it. That's contracting for today. Let's move on now, neatly, I guess, to our theory slot, which, Rory, you're going to be running that for us. And I guess today you're going to be sharing with us all about the necessary and sufficient conditions as identified by Mr. Carl Rogers.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
Welcome to Counselling Theory with Rory. And in this podcast, I'm going to discuss the core conditions. And it's a term that's used in counselling training and counselling therapy all over the training world. And I'm sure that everybody listening to this has probably be familiar with the term, the core conditions. So here's the first bombshell. Carl Rogers never used the term, the core conditions. This term was coined by the British person-centred movement in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it separated 3 conditions from Rogers' 6. So there were in fact 6 conditions that were needed for clients to be able to get the best from therapy and for therapists to be able to be the best therapist they can be. And the core conditions of empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard are what's sometimes referred to as facilitative conditions or the client's conditions. In other words, those are the conditions the client needs for the therapy to be able to work. They need to be transmitted, for want of a better word, from the therapist to the client so the client can get into the approach of being able to look at self and be able to make those changes. So what are the hidden conditions? Well, the hidden conditions are 3 conditions that are sometimes known as either the therapist conditions or sometimes the hidden conditions. And they are psychological contact, that at some level the client has to see and accept the congruence and the unconditional positive regard from the therapist. And finally, that the client is incongruent. In other words, the client has something to bring. So let's just have a look at those in a little more detail. Psychological contact means that the therapist and the client are on the same page psychologically. So if you had someone who was going through a very difficult psychotic episode, or someone who was under the influence of medication or street drugs or alcohol, that might be very difficult for both the therapist and the client to be in the same frame of reference. In other words, be roughly on the same page psychologically. So Rogers put a lot of stock in that about people being connected. The second condition is that the therapist needs to transmit congruence, unconditional positive regard and empathy. But crucially, the client needs to understand and accept that the therapist is there to help them. And they need to accept and feel at some level the congruence and the unconditional positive regard. They need to understand and accept that the therapist is there as a genuine person trying to help them. And the final hidden condition is client incongruence. In other words, the client really has to have something to bring to therapy. And without that, the therapy won't work. So the client needs to be, for want of a better phrase, in some kind of psychological distress. So those are the hidden conditions. And Tony Merry, in the book Learning and Being, he makes the point there's an ethical dimension to these conditions because they also allow a therapist to make a view if therapy can take place from the therapist's point of view. If psychological contact isn't in place, then clearly therapy can't take place. If for some reason the client just doesn't trust the counsellor for whatever reason that is, and won't accept they're trying to be helped, then quite clearly it's going to be very difficult to form a therapeutic relationship. And finally, if someone turns up and say, well, really, I've got nothing to discuss, there's nothing I really want to, I've not got any problems, then again, it's very difficult to form a therapeutic alliance. People have to come with at least something that they want to discuss. So as I say, Tony Merry in Learning and Being, which is a really good book, and we might put a link to that in the show notes. If you order that book, you can get it off eBay. and it's really, really useful. And it's a great book for trainers as well. So if you're a trainer listening to this, Tony Merry's Learning and Being, excellent for very, very good group work ideas. So let's talk about why Roger's ideas of the necessary and sufficient conditions, those 6 conditions we talked about, and especially the 3 conditions, were so important. Well, to do that, we need to take ourselves back to the 1930s, the 1940s, where psychoanalysis was the predominant therapy of the time. Now, unlike person-centered therapy, psychoanalysis relied on the therapist being a blank slate, distancing themselves somewhat from the clients and not getting involved on a personal level with the clients. And when I say getting involved with the personal level, on the personal level, I'm talking about a veil of expertise of making a point that the psychoanalyst is the expert and the client is the person who needs help. And in fact, they had a term for that in the psychoanalysis world: analyst and analysand. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Analysand. That was the phrase that they used for clients. So when Rogers changed his view and decided to find another way of therapy, and remember Maslow called Rogers' ideas the third force in psychology. Psychoanalysis was the first, behaviorism was the second, and humanism, which Rogers and Maslow and Rollo May and a lot of other therapists pioneered, was the third force in psychology. And for humanism to work, the therapist had to be, surprise, surprise, a human being, real, genuine, and active in the therapeutic relationship. So Rogers believed that one of the reasons that people struggled in their lives was they were working to conditions of worth and introjected values. They were living life on other people's terms, and they were withholding or muting or pushing down their own organismic valuing process. In other words, the people they wanted to be were being pushed away by themselves to please others. That's the shorthand of the theory. And Rogers believed that by using those core conditions of empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard, that the client would feel safe enough to be able to access their own potential, their own self-actualization, as Maslow talked about it, to be able to find the answers in themselves. And one of the things to consider is that psychoanalysis really focused on the past, whereas person-centered therapy focuses on the here and the now. So let's just take those core conditions one by one and work out and discuss why they're so important. Well, empathy is used by therapists to try to access the frame of reference of clients. In other words, try and see their perceptual reality. So a person-centered therapy isn't about analysing or dishing out theories to why somebody is feeling the way they are. They're about trying to understand the way they are, and the way we do that is by using empathy. We enter the client's frame of reference. We try and see and be as close to the client's reality with the thoughts and the feelings that are attached to that, so we can see and feel where they are. And by that, there's 2 very strong connections. The first is the client feels understood, the client feels heard, but also the client isn't alone. And this is a real key thing with empathy. They have a partner on their journey of life going through those difficulties, someone who's walking with them emotionally. And this was a big difference from the blank slate of psychoanalysis, where the analyst would be telling the client what was wrong with them. And in fact, Rogers has a wonderful quote on empathy. He wrote in 1975, "If I am truly open to the way of life is experienced by another person, if I can take his or her world into mine, then I risk seeing the life in his or her way, and of being changed myself, and we all resist change. Since we all resist change, we tend to view the other person's world only in our terms, not in his or hers. Then we analyse and evaluate it. We do not understand their world, But when the therapist does understand how the client truly feels and be in another person's world without wanting to try to analyse, change or judge it, then the therapist and the client can truly blossom and grow in that climate. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? So that is why empathy is so important. And here's an historical footnote for you. Rogers believed that congruence was the most powerful of those three conditions of congruence, empathy and unconditional positive regard. Rogers believed that it was actually congruence that was the most important one. Research through the years has pointed to empathy being the most powerful of the conditions, where people feel heard, understood, valued. So let's move on to congruence. What is congruence? It's an interesting word. It means being genuine. And genuine is about the person being a real person, being absolutely themselves. And I always say to my students, if you were to see me in the supermarket doing my shopping, or maybe having a curry and a cup of tea, which is one of my favourite pastimes, I would be the same person that you'd see in class. I might be a little less louder because I have to kind of articulate my voice in class because I have quite a few students. But generally speaking, I'm the same person. So person-centred counsellors don't put on this way of being. They are this way of being. And it's not unusual for people who train in person-centred therapy to take those conditions of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard into their own lives and use them in their interactions with people other than clients. And I always say to people, I have a bit of a volume control on my core conditions. I turn them up and I turn them down, so they're on full volume in the therapy room. But I might just turn them down just a little in everyday life because not everybody wants therapy. So sometimes you have to turn them up and turn them down a little bit. But congruence is about being absolutely real and really different, I guess, from the psychoanalysts of the time who were a blank screen. They'd reveal very little of their own personality in therapy. So again, the client is seeing a real, genuine person in front of them, and one who is okay. That's a real thing. We can't underestimate the idea that at some level the therapist is kind of showing that they're okay, if and certainly around things like people making mistakes. I've had clients in the past who've said I make a lot of mistakes, and I say, well, I make loads of them. I made a few on this podcast already. And if people can see it's okay for that, if they've been under conditions of worth where they've been told they mustn't make mistakes, if they can see someone, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to get it wrong, then it's all right for them. And that can be a very, very liberating feeling for clients. And then the final of the core conditions, unconditional positive regard. If you think of the life that we lead nowadays, we're under the judgment and scrutiny of everybody, our employers, the government, everyone. We're told what to do a lot. And unconditional positive regard is around the idea that the therapist doesn't judge the clients. We know from psychological studies that children who've been brought up in environments where they've been heavily judged or heavily criticised become psychologically damaged in some cases, or their functioning becomes very difficult for them. They're so frightened of making a mistake that sometimes they just don't do anything. So to have a therapist who offers this unconditional positive regard can be quite powerful, and it can break a cycle that a client has of they have to be perfect, or around shame. Shame is a huge emotion and feeling that clients can bring to the therapy room. And as a consequence of that, the therapist offering unconditional positive regard will break that cycle of shame, and it'll allow the clients to be able to speak about their difficulties without feeling criticised or judged or belittled. Really, really powerful. And it's this I'll accept you as you are attitude that the person-centred therapist has. And always maintaining a positive attitude to the clients. And sometimes that can be difficult because in therapy we separate the person from the behaviour, and some clients' behaviour can be very difficult to understand. And we certainly don't condone bad behaviour, but we don't judge it. And that is the subtle difference. I know a lot of my students say, well, what happens if I get someone in who's committed a terrible crime? Do I have to, I kind of have to say to them, well, I think that's okay. And I say, no, what you're doing is you're seeing the person. So you're separating, I guess the phrase would be the sin from the sinner. It's the person that we're accepting. So with those three conditions, if they're transmitted by the therapist to the client, then by default, in the theory, therapy will take place. And through the years, a lot of people have criticised person-centred therapy. They've talked about how is it possible for a therapist to offer those conditions consistently in the therapy room. And to be fair, this is difficult. We're all human beings, and sometimes I think our volume controls on those conditions can turn up and turn down. But if it's our intent to offer them, then almost certainly our clients will benefit from our use of those core conditions.
One of the really important things when you train to be a therapist is to understand the use of skills. And there's no better person that can teach skills than Kelly. Ken taught with me at the college that I work in, and he has a real passion for skills, a real deep knowledge of skills. And Kenny's going to tell you about the very first skill maybe that therapists need to know and really take on, and that's the skill of silence.
Counselling Skills with Ken Kelly.
I recognise silence can feel uncomfortable. It can feel heavy. Silence can really feel unnatural. And it's no wonder. If we look to our culture, there are words that we use. We speak about uncomfortable silences. You're having a conversation with a friend, and then suddenly there is this, and the term is awkward silence, where nobody knows what to say. And both of you are racing around in your minds to find words that will fill that silence, because boy, is it awkward and it feels heavy within. But here's the thing, we're not talking about silence in a conversation with a friend. We're talking about silence as a skill within a counselling setting, within a therapeutic relationship for the sole benefit of the client's movement and journey. And it's very different. It's a different kind of silence. And it's a silence that we need to understand, and it's a silence that we need to practice. I can't emphasize this enough. You need to practice silence within your skills sessions. So when silence is mentioned to my beginner learners who are starting their journey into counselling, and I give them an exercise to go away and come back and say what silence means for them and how they think it is appropriate in the counselling relationship, I rarely get more than 5 to 10 minutes of feedback from that group after their group discussion. But the interesting thing is, when I give that same topic to my level 4 learners who are now approaching the end of their counselling journey, we can happily sit and speak for an hour or more just on the power of silence. And this is because they are now, more rounded practitioners. They've been in practice and they've actually seen the actual power of silence within their placements, within the clients, within the counselling relationship. So let's start off with a definition of what silence is. So we're going to go for a really dry definition here, a textbook definition that would fit nicely in, say, an assignment if you had to describe silence. So here it is. Silence within counselling has been defined as the temporary absence of any overt verbal or paraverbal communication between counsellor and client within sessions. Wow, that is dry. It is accurate, but it is dry and very academic. When comparing that to what silence really is, when you do take it into a counselling relationship, when it is present and you see the difference that it can make in a client's journey. So, if we were to divide silence into silence and its benefits or uses for the counsellor, and silence and its benefits or purpose for the client, we might kind of have two tables. So on the counsellor side, we could use a deliberate use of silence to encourage the client to explore themselves. So they might look to us and we would use silence to kind of reflect that back and say, no, you look yourself. Showing I'm not the expert, I'm not here to guide you and give you the advice. This lies with you. For me, this kind of keys very much into unconditional positive regard. It's that trust that the client will find their own way. So if they look at me expectantly, I might use silence and a smile. And it's about the body language within that silence. Cold stare in silence, that has a really different tone to a warm, accepting smile in silence. So for the counsellor, it can be a deliberate use of silence to encourage the client to carry the burden of the conversation. Now, I'm taking these words from the counsellingtutor.com website, and of course I'll put a link in the show notes of today's podcast episode, so you can go and look at this yourself. They're all written out there for you, so you don't need to take these notes now. We've done that for you. Carry the burden of the conversation. I guess a respectful way of saying that is that you are giving the client autonomy within that conversation, within the session, that they set the pace, that they set how the counselling is going to go. It's not my pace, it's their pace, and that we can do through use of silence. We're not jumping in and setting the tempo of the counselling session by picking up and asking a question or leading somewhere else. We're allowing the client the autonomy to do that themselves. So for the counsellor, it can be an organisational use of silence to enable you, the counsellor, to kind of collect your thoughts, your feelings, to process what the client is saying. There are times where the client will bring something, and as the counsellor, I really do need a moment or two to understand what that is, to be with them. So silence is a great place to do that. If I'm immediately launching into the skill of reflection or paraphrasing, am I allowing myself as the counsellor to fully absorb what it is that that client has shared? And for the counsellor, I guess it can be used as a natural ending to a discussion, to a bit of material that the client has brought, and maybe the client has brought this material and they've kind of reached a natural end on that, and maybe they want to go somewhere else now. A little bit of silence, almost a gear change in between that, allows the client that space, I guess, to head off and pick up new material. So that's for the counsellor. Let's have a look for the client now. So use of silence for the client. So time for the client to make connections, to wait for the words or the images to come up for them. And I guess I can really relate to this. Oftentimes I'll be in a conversation with somebody and suddenly I'm searching around for a word or a thought or a feeling, and it's just not there. And I need a bit of time. And I'll often find myself apologizing and saying, oh, just give me a sec. I just can't grab it. It's now, if we allow the silence, it allows the client to kind of search around, get their thoughts together, to find the images, to find the feelings. And very often, remember, a client is coming into counselling, and this is the first time they're really putting names to feelings. They're searching for names for feelings that they don't really know. For them, it's kind of a knot in their stomach or a tightness in their chest, and now they're trying to find a word to describe that. Silence gives them the time to really look and find the words to be able to share that with you as a counsellor. So for the client, another one is it can be a space where the feelings can be nurtured and allowed to develop. This one I think is really important. For me, this is process. So counselling is about process, that the client brings material, we share that with them, we look at it, and then the client gets to process that material. And it is through the processing of that material that they move from rigidity to fluidity. They process, and there is an organismic shift within them, and therefore they have a moment of movement. That comes from process. And here's the truth. No process happens when words are being spoken. Ever, 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 ever. Yes, there are words that will lead to the process, but the process itself happens only in silence. So to allow that silence is really respectful. Allow that so that the client can develop and nurture those feelings and process what is going on for them. So a space where the client is able to recover from here and now emotions. It may well be that the weight of the material that is being brought is heavy, emotionally heavy, that tears are streaming down the face of the client as they feel the pain that has maybe been suppressed, that is right there in the room, in the here and now. Silence is respectful for those emotions. Allow the space for those emotions to be felt fully. So for the client, it can be when the client kind of is looking to you as the counsellor to set the pace, to have the answers, to set the agenda, to give them the strategies and ways that they should be coping. In person-centered therapy, at least, that's not what a counsellor is there to do. Counsellor is there to be with the client as they find their own way. So if the client looks to you, a use of silence again with a warm, accepting smile kind of gives that message of, it's okay, I trust you to find the way here. You know, there's words we can use there. When a client says, you know, I wonder what you might think about this, to you as the counsellor. And we may say, oh, I hear you saying, I wonder what I might do. But I'm thinking this is your journey. What is it that you would do? That's a way of saying it verbally. The same thing can be said with a very warm, accepting smile and silence. Try it. That is really powerful within your, a powerful skill that you can bring in to your counselling sessions. And as we as counsellors sometimes need a little bit of silence to kind of get our thoughts together, to be 100% there with the material that is going on, the same is true for the client. So it's organizational use of silence to kind of, wow, this is big stuff that we're looking at here. I just need a moment or two just to get everything in order. So there you go. There's some stuff maybe for your assignment, but of course it links through to the skill of silence. So deeper than that, and I guess for me what silence is that silence has different tones. We speak about different tones of our voice, different tones in language, but silence has different tones as well. And silence is not about just being there and being quiet. Silence is about 100% being present with the client within that silence. We almost listen to the silence in the same ways we would listen to the verbal communication that would come from the client. And you don't need to look far at studies to see that most of our communication anyway as human beings is without words. It's only a small portion of our communication is verbal. The rest is body language. And that is presence within the silence. But we need to be there 100% present as the counsellor to be able to hear that within the silence. So when silence arrives within the counselling relationship, communication hasn't stopped. Communication continues. I want to give you an example of that. Have you ever been in an argument with a loved one where you're kind of not talking to one another anymore? And the silence, maybe one person would talk and you're not answering back. Think of the power and the message that has been broadcast in that silence. Well, it is just as powerful and just as meaningful within the counselling relationship if we allow it. Now, here's the thing. It's about us allowing that silence, and we can only allow that silence if we work at it, if we train. And I implore you, I really do, I implore you to take silence into your next skill sessions and work on it. Really, really work on it. But it's about appropriate use of silence. You know, silence can sometimes be uncomfortable and embarrassing for the right reasons. And I'll give you an example of that. Even Rogers, I'm going to give you a Rogers quote. He says, in an initial interview, long pauses or silence are likely to be embarrassing rather than helpful. In subsequent contacts, however, if fundamental rapport is good, silence on the part of the counsellor may be a most powerful device. From the very lips of Mr. Carl Rogers. So even Carl Rogers says, you know, that it's okay for silence to be uncomfortable, embarrassing at times, because silence is only an effective tool when it is used appropriately, and you need relational depth to be able to use that silence appropriately. You at least need to have a good rapport built with the client. I could speak easily for an hour on the subject of silence. I love it. I think it is an incredibly powerful skill. I know it to be an underused skill because of what it brings up for us as therapists. But hey, you know what? This whole journey about being a therapist, becoming a counselor, is about us exploring self and that we struggle with. We got to move past that. Examine it within yourself. Put the skill of silence into your next skill sessions. Practice it, hone it, and watch the power of silence.
Always a pleasure to hear Ken talk about skills, such a breadth of knowledge and such a skill in not only talking about the theory, but getting people to apply it. So thanks for that, Ken.
Yeah, and it kind of brings us to the end of our first podcast together. I guess if we were in a counselling session, I'd be saying, just a few minutes left now. And yes. I really hope this has been useful for you. It has been our maiden voyage. Hopefully it's been packed with some useful stuff that you can use. I'd just like to give you some useful links. The one is our podcast show notes. You'll find them on our website. It's our mother website. It is www.counsellingtutor.com. Now, this is the British spelling of counselling, because we live in the UK, so counselling in the UK is spelt with two L's. I know that in other parts of the world it's only one, so it's counsellingtutor with two L's.com. Go and have a look there, and you'll get the show notes for this podcast. We'd love you to talk about what you've learned here, what you're getting from here, make some suggestions of what you'd like to see here, and you can do that on our Facebook group, secret group, but you can come and join in. It's just go on to Facebook and put in Counselling Tutor. It's the one right at the top. Say, I want to join. We'll let you in and come and join hundreds and hundreds of fellow like-minded learners who are also on the journey to become counsellors.
Lots of students and indeed qualified professionals talking about theory and chatting about their experiences. So it's the place to be. So just get there. And if you say hi, Rory, and hi, Ken, we'll probably type back and say, hello, how are you?
and mention on there what you want to hear in these podcasts, because this is about servicing you guys. You tell us what you want to hear, and we'll have a think about that and see how we can deliver it for you.
Yep. Okay. Well, we'll see you there.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.